Hello, everyone. This is Raphael.
I'm Loryn.
We're the Pacheco siblings, and welcome to the Hypercube podcast, a talk show in which two siblings converse about anything and everything. So, I guess we have a bit of an interesting conversation ahead of us. I guess this is something of a
Indeed.
continuation, but also not. Because
a continuation in spirit.
In spirit. Yeah, because there was an episode we did in the first season where you talked briefly about gender. It was kind of a brief, kind of insert episode. I think we were short on time and having a difficult schedule. But you had, which I guess we're in the same position now. So it's fitting.
Basically. Yeah, that's exactly the same thing.
But yeah, you talked about gender and why you made your case for why you don't actually, the colloquial you doesn't actually believe in
the royal
two
you.
genders. Yeah, the royal you.
Yeah. Which I still believe.
Okay, so that hasn't changed. Good mental.
Yes.
Okay, but you realized that was kind of not really the point you wanted to make, and you wanted to abstract it a little bit, which I feel like we've been doing a lot of lately, is abstracting our conversations, because there's definitely meta conversations to be had, right? The conversation about the conversation, and you were telling me before we started recording that was basically symptomatic of a larger issue or conversation that you feel you need to get at. So yeah. I guess abstracting it more to the idea of binaries in general and what you mean by that.
Yeah. And a lot of that it comes down to, especially because when it comes to this kind of, talking about the identity politics aspect of it, I realize arguing this one hyper-specific thing, like the idea of, I don't think you actually believe in two genders, is not actually useful. Even if I won that conversation, you can't win conversations. If I won that argument, right? It's like, hey, I'm going to argue for the fact that you maybe don't believe in two genders. And then someone else is like, yeah, but I do though. It's like, okay, whatever. I can make all the logical points that I want. I can make all of the observations about how a person interacts with the world and the things that they do and the things that they say, and because of that, you obviously do not believe in two genders. And they'll go, yeah, but I do though. And that's the end of it.
Right. Yeah.
So I was like, the thing is, I realized that's not useful. It was a clever way for me to get the topic started, but I don't think that's what I need to do. What I really want to do is I want to talk about why I believe the things that I believe in, and why I think you believe in the things that you believe in. And I want you to look at that, right? Just step back away from yourself and say, what is it that I actually believe in? Because I don't think it has anything to do with gender. It just happens to be the current symptomatic manifestation of what I believe is an incorrect belief in general. Not anything to do politically either. It's just of society, of human beings. This thing that we have come to believe ourselves of how the world works. So,
okay. Yeah. So what do you mean by that? Unpack that for me.
The idea is specifically, you don't believe in two genders, is the idea that what I was trying to get at is that obviously there is more than one gender. And the reason is because there's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum of genders
more than two, you mean?
Oh, yeah. Well, there's also more than one.
Yeah, there's definitely more than one. I think everyone can agree on that.
I think that we're all in agreement, but more than two. Yeah. There's a spectrum, right? And on both ends, you have the idea of the masculine and the feminine. It's just that I think people are too caught up looking at everything on the ends, and they're completely ignoring the middle, right? And my deal was to say, you do understand that there is a middle, and you have and most people regularly acknowledge the fact that there is a middle. It's just that in the way that the language is kind of presented itself, they don't see that as being a part of the conversation. That's completely separate, right? Especially because of how the politics around it all has kind of shaped it as this is a separate topic to talk about, that people will think about the culture that they live in and the things that they say about gender and identity and the presentation of individuals as separate from the idea of gender, which is very strange to me. So the idea that there is a spectrum, I've realized is the idea that I want to focus on, is because I don't think anybody actually believes in binary decisions. There is just these two options, yes and no, left and right, and that's it. Nothing else in the middle. There is no gray. It's only black and white, right? I don't think anyone actually believes in that.
You're saying in general, not specifically about gender, but about everything.
Yeah, about everything. And the way that we talk, the way that we think about the world, we acknowledge the fact that there is usually at least a third option, which is none of the above.
Right. Yeah.
And It's like just the idea of that alone is like, I don't think anyone actually believes in that. So I want to talk about the idea of the binary, the myth of the binary, how I think that came to be, and why I don't think most people, if not everybody, I don't think most people believe in it.
In binaries.
When they stop to think about it, when they stop to think about what they actually believe and not what they were taught to believe and not what they were told that they believe, but the things that you do, things that you say, the way you think about the world, I don't think you actually believe in a binary at all, and that everything is a spectrum. At the very least, there's 3 options.
Right. At minimum.
At minimum. That's kind of where I wanted to start.
Yeah, which I guess the idea of the spectrum is something that comes up very often in our conversations. Like, it feels like that's kind of a recurring theme, which I don't know how strong it's been on the Hypercube specifically, but that's definitely on like our conversations
between
bingo
us,
card.
Yeah.
But if not, it probably ought to be on the Hypercube bingo card.
Right.
But that's interesting.
Oh, that's a great idea. Podcast bingo card.
I mean, every podcast informally has one, right? It's like
that's true.
Talking about institutions on the Good Faith podcast, or talking about airports on the RT podcast, at least back in the era that I listened to it.
Exactly.
But yeah, so I guess if it isn't maybe that this could be an establishment for it, but it's definitely something in our personal conversations that comes up often. But I'm curious to see, I guess, again, getting back into this idea of meta conversations, right? Like, we very rarely have a conversation about the conversation about spectrums. Yeah. And I guess now you trying to apply this very universally. I'm very curious where this is going to go. But what's your sort of starting point here? I guess that is your starting point, but where do we go? Where are you going?
I think it just comes down to the idea that binaries are unnatural, literally unnatural, not found in nature, right? Nature prefers a spectrum, a wide range between this and that. And people like to use nature as like this totem of like what is correct and what is right. And then they will artificially implant their ideas of stuff onto nature. The idea that like, oh, nature is always like, of course, like there's only males and females in nature. And it's like, yeah, most of the time only in mammals. What about sea anemones, which are non-gendered? What about hydra, which are asexual beings who have a clone lineage going down for like the beginning of time, probably? Like, what about different species of like insects, like ants and bees, whose gender is chosen at birth by pheromones to be a certain role, and their gender, not gender, their sex, because again, gender is, to get into that later, but like the sex, right? Like, that's something that is chosen because that body type performs a duty correctly. What about things that are born without genitalia until they meet something of the opposite, but whatever they need to then be able to like say, okay, I'm now needed to be this thing so that my species can continue. Like in certain kind of fish, like I think the parrotfish can do that. You take this very narrow idea of like nature, mammals mostly, and say this is natural, but it's not. Even in mammals, there isn't just 2 sexes. Even in mammals. On a very funny level, there's the platypus, first of all, which is a mammal that
platypus
lays eggs. Platypus. But even still, it's like you can try to like pseudoscience your way down into it and say like, oh yeah, but like, okay, but maybe it's not 2 sexes. It's like the chromosomal aspect of it, right? It's like you have like the X and Y sex determination chromosomes. Like, yes, but one of those is going away. Like, we are slowly losing, what is it, the X chromosome? Is that because XY is male, XX, no. The Y chromosome?
Yeah,
XX
Y
is male, XX is female. Yeah, the Y chromosome is going away. And even like within like the genetic diversity of different species, it's not always XY chromosomes. There's like XYZW chromosomes that are sex determinants in like other species. The point is, nature is way more complicated than you can really kind of boil it down into 2 things. There's always going to be an exception. Every single time there will be an exception.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Not just now, even down to the beginning of like how organisms were formed, there will probably be an exception.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because I guess to kind of plug in here, I guess that's one thing that I want to talk about, because I'm sure we'll have plenty personally of differences between us in worldview with regard to the gender conversation. But the and I'm sure we'll, like you said, the idea here is to abstract this to more universally as we go on. But since we're starting there, the point you make here is actually one I've had to reckon with more recently. Because like I said, or at least I was saying before we started recording, I've actually had a lot of shifting perspectives on this like conversation in recent years.
Yeah, and I'm really curious to see what that is.
Yeah, as recently as last year, I've had a pretty.
I thought you were going to say as recently as yesterday.
No, that would be something. That would be podcast material right there.
Oh, absolutely, it would be
prime podcast material. But I think as recently as this last year, I've definitely had to change my mind on some things because what I realized is, so I've kind of historically been hesitant to subscribe to this definition of gender, right? That says that it's a social construct, right? I think I've been a little bit hesitant about that because that felt like a kind of compromise of what I believe to be true. However, I've more recently changed my mind about that. And actually, interestingly, not because anybody persuaded me. It was just based purely on observation. In this case,
that's usually how it goes.
Yeah, nobody had really made an argument about it to me. Although perhaps I would be more resistant if they did. But it was just simply based on observation of the discovery and a bit of a deep dive into the concept of which you've kind of dived into here, right? You said with mammals, right? We generally think of as being in a binary, but even then, it's not quite so, cut and dry. Because there is such a thing as intersexed. And the existence, like the sheer existence of intersexed peoples and animals is
hyenas. Crazy stuff.
Something that I've kind of been doing a bit more research on, or at least was at one point when I was first discovering it, that I've had to kind of reckon with in terms of narrowing my definitions, at least. And I think, and here's the thing that really was a kicker for me, because first off, let's be clear, intersexed peoples are extremely rare, right? It's certainly not the norm, but they do exist.
I'll get into that as well.
Right.
There is a definition of intersex that is extremely rare.
Yes. I suppose you'll get into that later on. But for the most part, generally, right, people who are not clearly biologically male or female are very rare. They're not there is a spectrum, but there is a clear normal, but there is a minority that exists that is not clearly male or female, completely biologically. And right, and that's just natural, right? No human intervention, no nothing. That's just the way they're born.
Yep.
And what surprised me most about that, though, was finding out first off the communities that form around these and the culture. Oftentimes, because it's kind of a rare thing, alike people tend to gravitate towards each other, and so oftentimes they do kind of these kinds of things or these kinds of peoples do find each other out, and then kind of have small communities around it. But and even so, even in the absence of community, I have found this to be true, that shockingly, most intersexed people, this is purely anecdotal, I don't have data to back this up, but just based on anecdotal observation of intersex people that I've seen in conversation or anything like that, it seems like most of them do subscribe to a culturally traditional idea of a binary of genders, right? And they will generally identify as either male or female, or man or woman. And you would think these of all people, would have every right to identify as non-binary, right? Because they are biologically not
literally non-binary.
Yeah, clearly not clearly male or female, right? So it's you'd think of all people, they have every right to identify as non-binary. And yet most of them, it seems, don't. Most of them subscribe to a binary of genders and prefer to identify as one or the other.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so that being said, that has definitely resolved for me that gender inherently does have to be a social construct, because of the fact that if we're going by, like you said, nature, which is, I guess, the primary argument for a lot of people who share a lot of my perspective on this would use, is just going by nature.
Here is an example of somebody refusing nature to pick a gender.
Right. Well, exactly. And to put it, I guess, succinctly to my point is, in order for my perspective to be correct, gender does have to be a social construct, right? Like even if like I want to be correct there, it has to be a social construct for me to get there, right? Just from nature, just based on how the world is and how people are. And just the existence of these people, however much a minority, right? I think the only counter argument you can make is a terrible one, which is basically to dehumanize intersex people. But that's not a territory I want to go into.
Unfortunately, people are very willing to do that as well.
That is fair. I think there are definitely people who are willing to dehumanize perfectly human people that will have less, cognitive dissonance on that front. Yeah, like I will have less qualms about that. And that's unfortunate. Yeah. But I'm not going to do that. So, which means I have to.
I'm not.
Yeah, which means I have to realize that gender does have to be socially constructed in order for me to even continue asserting my perspective. It has to be. So that's definitely something I've had to reckon with. But yeah, unless you're going to dehumanize them, or I guess to bring it into like a theological realm for me, right? Like unless you want to admit that God makes mistakes in creating human beings, that cannot, then it cannot be true that gender is, entirely natural and not a social construct.
And that's an interesting thing is the spectrum in and of itself of different kinds of intersexed presentations, because intersex can happen for many number of reasons. Some of it is just completely natural. Some of it is I don't want to say from birth defects, right? But it's like from something not presenting as it should, like either genetic or something else. Like intersex even happen from injury. An injury can happen in the womb that can cause an intersex presentation. And here's the really big problem is because this idea of sex being binary, which is something else I'll talk about later, not just gender and sex, because I think, are we on the same page that gender and sex are two very different things?
We are now, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Currently.
So
that again, after recent adjustments, yes, we are.
Yeah. Because again, I want to stray away from this topic in specificity and talk about general later, but now that you brought it up, like I just want to talk about this because it's fascinating. Even the spectrum of intersexed is giant. Like a very small percentage of people are intersexed, right? And do you know how many people who are born, I guess, like perfectly healthy and normal, right? But with that one slight little change of just maybe their genetics or just the presentation, like the phrase your balls drop, right? Mm-hmm. That happens in the womb most of the time. And if it doesn't, your testicles ascended, like held up in your abdomen, and sometimes they'll drop later as you are growing up and outside of the womb. That will happen. Totally normal thing that can happen. The problem is many people who are born that way, the doctor will look at their genitals and say, that is a female. And then they'll get that stamped on their birth certificate. The parents are like, all right, we're going to now treat you as a female. And for their entire life, they're treated as a female until suddenly wait a minute, what's that? Wait a minute, that's not supposed to happen. You're not a female. And they're like, no, I've been trying to tell you this whole time. Because most of the time they'll know. But there's a lot that happens where mistakes by doctors at birth will affect how a person's gender manifests, either misrepresenting or misdiagnosing a sex at birth, or seeing an intersexed presentation and saying this is a birth defect and must be corrected surgically. And then that person grows up never knowing that they are in fact intersexed because they were surgically corrected to fit into one or the other. And most of the time it's arbitrary which one they get corrected into. Because there are females with full functioning reproductive organs who will, in addition to their full functioning reproductive female organs, also have a pair of testicles. And they'll say, okay, well, you have both. We'll just pick one to keep.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like wild, the examples that are out there, right? Like, it's just like, there are people who can grow a full head of facial hair and can also be pregnant, right? Like it's wild. But it's
totally naturally without any
completely
additional surgery, without any additional surgery or additional hormone treatments. That is just how they are.
Right. And well, like you said, sometimes I didn't even know that there were cases in which like the human intervention was to like correct to the binary, right? Like to correct away from their nature in that case.
Yeah. So anyways, going a little bit more general again.
Yes. Yeah. To abstract it, because we're getting in the weeds here.
Getting in the weeds. And oh man, I would love to get into the weeds about.
Yeah. That's a different podcast than the one.
Yeah. I mean, that might be a separate thing, but yeah, getting into the spectrum of of gender and sex it's a fascinating thing for me, because the more I look into it, the more things that I understand about the more things that I find out about like the human body and how we develop and just like how people around me kind of exist. And I'm like, the world's way cooler than I thought it was. And people are way cooler than I thought they were. Which is also like another thing. It's just like, why do you only want two options? Why? Just like just in general. So if you had to like pick between two options of a thing or three options of a thing, what would you rather have? Three options of a thing. More options is more better. That's my opinion. Maybe that's an opinion that I am incorrect in. I'm not sure. However, anyway, so nature works in analog, right? And the idea of a binary, a simple 1 or 2, all it takes is for one exception for that to be proven completely incorrect, right?
Right.
And of course, I could do that, but that's not.
Yeah, which is what makes that like a difficult thing to sustain, because it's just like if
exactly,
and because you're talking about like an absolute there, right? Like that is like either completely true, or if there's one exception, it's completely false, right? Which one exception, with a lot of things, with most things, really, is not difficult to find.
Exactly. And that's the kind of thing where it's like, especially when people around me talk about like, oh, there's only two genders. And I'm like, if you talk to me anymore and discover who I am, you are already wrong. Like if you just understood who you were talking to, me, this non-binary individual who's standing in front of you, a proof literally standing in front of you that there was more than two. Like there's just, it's all you need. It's just one person to identify as being non-binary or something else. And suddenly you're just wrong. But that's not really what they're talking about, right? They're not talking about the gender, they're talking about something else. Because I think what we're talking about when we talk about this binary, not to do with gender, not to do with politics, not to do with personal preference or anything like that. It's this idea that the binary, the right and the wrong, the yes and the no, is comfortable. It's like it's something that we as a species are striving to find in everything that we see to kind of like get through life, right? It's something that we've created for ourselves to say, I don't have to think about this too much. I have created these categories, boom, boom, and now I can move forward. I can move on. I can continue doing whatever it was that I was doing, surviving or starting a company or doing anything that you need to do. And you don't have to think about it any more than that. And you just go bang, bang, done and dusted through our two categories, because for the most part, it holds up, right? 98% of the time, you're going to say, that's a female, that's a male, and you're going to be correct. However, having that opinion, having that, not opinion, but having that like that drive to coalesce everything into these categories it's not bad. You just have to understand that that's not true. It is a shortcut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you're saying that's like a human impulse in general. It kind of reminds me of, I'm trying to remember which Matthew Colville video this was, but there's a Matt Colville video out there where he talks about this very thing, right? Specifically, again, to kind of steer it away to a different realm of subject, right? I think he was talking with regards to like biological or like archaeological findings, or no, it would be like, right, and like discovering like bone fragments, say, of extinct creature, and just being like, oh yeah, these belong to like this group of thing, and then getting into like the kind of taxonomy of animals and how we categorize them. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, well, and then as we discover more things, we assign things into more categories and then refine those categories even more so. But the thing is, those categories didn't exist to begin with. And so when things eventually don't start fitting neatly, the more we discover, right, about a lot of different species.
There's a lot of and then gray area between.
And then it's just like, oh, well, what do we do? It's just like, but the problem is that's not like a natural thing, right? Those categories don't exist in nature. They exist in the human imagination. They're like arbitrary, essentially, designations for our convenience. But they didn't arise that way. They didn't arise for our convenience. They arise for a myriad of other factors. But they, that's just a thing we have to do in order to comprehend the world, essentially.
Exactly. And it comes down to the fact that the only tool that we have to describe the world around us is language.
Mm-hmm. And language is limited.
Language is limited. And language, well, I guess depending on the way you want to look at it, language is either shaped by culture or it shapes culture, right? Because it's essentially the same thing for our purposes. But
I think it's language. It's a dialogue.
People who discuss it might say one way or the other whether culture influences language or language influences culture. But yeah, so we use words to describe what we see, and then those words were created out of necessity to describe the world around us, and they were created out of, well, I guess that's just what it comes down to. They're created out of necessity, but they were created. And these words, these definitions that we assign to like these arbitrary sounds that we are making with our mouth are imperfect. They are imperfect representations of the world because one, we just don't understand how exactly down to the exact truth of the world. We don't understand it. We can't. We don't know the position and the velocity of every single atom around us. That would be the exact truth, right?
Right.
But we understand kind of the gist of it. We understand how that manifests itself in how we interact with each other and the macro objects that those atoms represent or like that come to become. But it's like, if I were to say, I'm sitting on a chair, right? In a very, very real, but not useful sense, I am not sitting on this chair. Because the idea of a me and the idea of this chair and the idea of sitting, you can twist that in any kind of linguistic thing you want to say. It's like, oh yeah, like, well, there's like a layer of emptiness between you and the chair because of the way that atoms are spaced between each other, right? They never actually touch. So you're not sitting on the chair. Or it's like, well, like, I'm also technically not sitting on the chair. I'm sitting on a towel on the chair. Like there's anything you do, but it doesn't matter. The language that we use, the language is flawed because what I'm trying to convey is I'm sitting on a chair. And you know what that means. And I can talk to you as if then we're talking about the same thing. Because when I say this series of sounds and these words in this order, there is a meaning that is conveyed that is close enough to the reality that we can both then operate on the same level and move forward. However, it is never, ever, ever that simple. And philosophers will have a field day telling you how wrong you are about the most minute little thing, right? Because kind of their job is to think about things too much. Or theoretical physicists, or anybody whose job is to think about it too much, to go into the minutia, the little intricate details of reality. But that's not useful for us.
Right.
And in a way, that is why we've been drawn towards this two gender idea. And it's because, for the most part, it's correct. There are only two genders. Bet you didn't see that coming, Raph.
No, yeah.
And here's why. Because this is, I was telling you as well at the beginning, like my kind of views have shifted as well. Because I used to think, like, yeah, there's like an infinite number of genders. And again, there are. But I've stopped thinking that that's a useful thing to think. It is not useful to think there's an infinite amount of genders. Because I don't interact with most people on a, hey, where on the masculine feminine spectrum do you interact, or like do you land, and how should I interact with you in this way? Because you can be masculine presenting but masculine presenting but want to be considered feminine, and sure, if you want that, totally dope. However, I don't talk to every single person that way. Most of the times I will know if I have to talk to somebody in a certain way, especially because like just you kind of can tell if somebody is right. Non-binary. But man, it's just so not useful of a concept for me in interacting with people to think about gender in more than two categories. And I get it. And now I understand why people have that need. But the only difference is that I don't try to force that belief on anybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also, I still don't believe in a binary. There is no binary. There is a bimodal distribution of gender. Bimodal means spectrum between 0 and 1. But most manifestations are 0 or 1. And everything in the middle, much, much less, right? Bimodal. Two modes. Two medians, what is it? Mode, median, and I forget. Math.
Mode,
that's what it is.
And well, no,
most. Mode, median, and most. I don't know. I could have sworn there was 3. Anyways,
yeah,
bimodal
I'm
distribution. That's what it actually is. It's not a binary. It's a bimodal distribution. Yes, for the most part, it is actually just two genders. But it's not only two genders. There was a lot of room in the middle for anyone to go down. And in fact, there's probably only one person whose exact gender definition is in the middle. There might be somebody in the middle they're the only person who interacts with gender in that way. And that's perfectly fine. I'm probably never going to meet that person. But if I did, I would be a lot more willing to talk about them, to talk with them about that interaction, because like I'm open to the idea that there is more than two.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a thing a lot with non-binary people who present either masculine or feminine, because like there's like a gender fluid, gender binary. There's a lot of people, a lot of different definitions, right? And for a lot of people, it just means like I am non-binary, which means I pick one of the two. And it's like, wait, hold on.
Right.
You can't be non-binary and pick one of the two, because that you're still saying there is a binary distribution of gender. You just aren't only one of them, right?
Mm.
And like you were saying with the intersex people, a lot of intersex will choose one or the other because that's just how most people present. Statistically speaking, most people are going to present masculine or feminine, regardless of what their sexuality or what their sexual makeup is. However, there's still a lot of room for crossover, and it's not everybody. Most people will fall into those two categories, but not everybody.
Yeah.
And that's basically where I'm at right now.
I feel like we're kind of in opposite day, where it's just like we come into this podcast and it's just like I'm the one saying that gender is a social construct, and you're saying there's two genders. It's like, what happened?
What's going on?
Yeah. All right. Somebody flip the script. But
yeah,
I think. Yeah. Oh, okay. A lot of thoughts here. But I think because especially when we abstracted it, I think that kind of gets into some interesting territory of, like the limits of language and what's comfortable and what's also useful. I think I like the pragmatic approach of talking about what's useful for human communication, because a lot of this stuff just isn't useful for human communication, right? Like it's not just, this isn't the way that people just naturally talk to each other on a day-to-day basis. In fact, most of the time it doesn't come up like at all, ever. And so,
well, again, like I said, like I am a living, breathing, non-binary individual. I exist somewhere in the middle, right? I don't present more or less, or I don't present more masculine or more feminine. I'm somewhere in the middle. I usually say around 60-40 masculine, feminine, right? Mm-hmm. I have never once brought that up with anybody, and I'm perfectly fine talking to people.
Yeah. And that's
like outside of people who like really get to know me, like just like having a normal conversation. I don't think I've ever once brought it up. I maybe had brought it up one time in a bar, but
yeah. And so, and I feel like I'm thinking of there's a Christian thinker by the name of Curtis Chang, who's been doing a lot of really interesting work lately. He hosts another podcast, the Good Faith podcast, that I listen to pretty regularly. But he ran that with David French for a while, but David French has moved on to other things, but still guests quite a bit. But Curtis Chang has done a lot of work. He recently wrote a book about basically the connection between anxiety and, our Christian spirituality. And he has posited a lot of interesting theorems on the idea that basically most of the issues we're facing in society right now, the gestures broadly, the situation is
the situation.
Yeah, basically say postures that the situation is largely an anxiety situation, right? Like the problems we're facing in society are generally just a collective anxiety problem, right? And that people just don't know how to deal with anxiety, basically. And a lot of
that's pretty accurate, I would say.
yeah. It's just like, and a lot of what you see at the extremes, right, is, especially at the far right, and perhaps just as much, if not more so, on the far left, right? A lot of those extremes are basically like fear responses to people who don't know how to process anxiety, right? And if we could have, and of course he's speaking primarily to a Christian audience, but it's like if we could have a deeper understanding of how our faith is meant to respond to anxiety, because like that is something it specifically is like by design meant to address that we are just not very literate on. I think for a lot of people, because we just don't have the theological tools, or I should say this is more of a praxis issue, I suppose, than a theological one. But but yeah, so it's just like, but one thing he kind of gets at a lot, and that I've heard many others make this point more recently too, is that is the position of narratives in handling anxiety, right? Because narratives are really strong ways for us to handle discomfort and uncertainty. And part of narratives is category building, right? And so it's just like having clear categories, having clear ways of communicating are things that make us feel safer and are, just help us to get past our day. Like we don't have to think about that anymore, right? Like we have our categories for it. And
boom, they are done and dusted. I know what to do moving forward.
Yeah, like I know what that is. And I think in that sense, actually, they're actually very useful. I think narratives and categories are actually very useful in that sense because we do need to get through our day, right? That is a thing we need to do.
Yeah.
And we don't need to...
Like, you know how much easier it is for me to think, or to me to get out of bed in the morning without thinking about literally everything in the world all at once and how that's, and how the nuance of it is affecting my life?
Yeah. It's like, it's not necessary, right? And it just bogs you down.
Not necessary at all.
And
yeah.
So...
I mean, sometimes I do, but...
Right. But you can't help that. But yeah, the point is categories are comfortable and
exactly.
And like, yeah. And before like, it can sound like we're like being too aggressive on that. Like I said, I would argue that comfort, right, enough to get through your day is actually useful. There is a pragmatism there that is not a bad thing in and of itself. It can get blown out of proportion though, as well. Of course, that's where like conspiracy theories come in, right?
But especially when you start thinking about those categories as strict fact.
Right. And like what you were saying of just kind of the need, right, to impose them. And there's a lot I could say about that, right? That's of to use the technical term illiberality, right? Of like having like that is definitely an impulse that comes out of insecurity. Right. Because I think somebody who's very secure in their worldview does not feel that impulse. Right. I remember there's actually, and especially for people in my faith, I remember there's this quote I heard recently. I can't remember who it was from, but I heard it kind of secondhand. And I'm like, that's actually a very useful quote, which is just like the sign of a mature Christian is somebody who isn't easily offended. And right, because but you could say the same thing about pretty much.
It's just a sign of maturity.
Yeah, a lot of worldviews. Right. Yeah. If you're mature, but specifically with regard to worldview, right? Like, I think if you're mature in your worldview, if you're secure in it, like that impulse largely dies out, right? Because it's just like, of course, you want to convince people if you believe that what you believe in is good, then there's a want to convince people. But the need to convince people, right? Like, I cannot rest until this person echoes my perspective. That's just for you, right? Like that is not a greater good situation. That is just a you thing, right? Like because that's not in your control, right? That's not something that you have the ability, first of all, right? Like to get in people's heads and enforce that, but also you just don't have the responsibility to do that. And it is not something, and trying to act like you do is not something that betters society. Or your own well-being for that matter, because then you'll just get frustrated when you realize the limits of your humanity. And being frustrated at being human is very common, but like not useful to your mental health. And so
that is an understatement.
Right. Both parts of that statement, I'd imagine. But yeah, like I think, and like I said, things like conspiracy theories and that sort of things are what happen when that useful impulse, like I said, it is useful and it is pragmatic, gets out of control, right? Because now you need narratives that's like expressing the need for narratives that explain things that really have rational explanations that are less harmful, and B, like sometimes it's just stuff that didn't need to be explained, right? It's just like, what does this all mean? It's just like, that was just a weather balloon, my man. That was like,
oh my goodness.
Yeah. And so, I mean, so it's like, that's the what happens when the need for categories and narratives gets out of control, and it can be very unhealthy and at worst extremely dangerous societally. And we've seen some of the repercussions of that. But right, so that's kind of my getting at the abstract of this, is that
exactly.
I think having binaries and having categories is ultimately a useful thing, and it can be a good thing. But if you keep it in moderation and realize that it doesn't necessarily
a binary in moderation. You know what? That's exactly what it is. It's like binaries in moderation. If you refuse to believe in the spectrum, please believe in the binary in moderation.
Yeah, precisely. And I think which I guess, moderation, another bingo card term for us,
right?
In our conversation.
Take that one.
But
take a shot.
Yeah.
Or something.
Really, this is like probably one of the most bingo card episodes we've had, but
Maybe.
for our common conversation points. But yeah, I think, again, there is a good thing there. And I think it's about having a moderation to not take it to extremes, and also realizing, like you said, that just because it's useful and maybe even good doesn't necessarily mean it is an objective reflection of reality. And I think trying to
Exactly.
Again, part of the impulse of trying to be right and trying to, that insecurity of having to assert yourself and getting people to agree with you is right. Like the degree to which that extends to you reaching out into the world and trying to retrieve
Like
objective facts from it that aren't necessarily there can be problematic. Not always, but can be.
Exactly.
And I think. But yeah, I think there is a healthy way to go about this. And ultimately, where to kind of bring it back out of the abstract and into like our concrete example that we've been using, which is this case study on gender. Like for me, it is still important to my worldview that there are a binary of genders. And I think that is a good thing. And I think that is a useful thing. And I think that it is a thing that leads to a prosperable outcome. And I'd be willing to try and convince people of that. But that is a different thing than trying to say, like, this is the reality we live in. And that needs to be accepted by everyone. And I think I've learned just by observing the reality we live in and just seeing the beauty in it and the beauty in people and the diversity that is in it that is completely natural and God created has helped me to have a little bit more existential humility about that and not having to be right all the time, but truly believing and having a conviction that my view is a good that people should be convinced of.
And that's something that I kind of want to get at as well, is it's okay to have a belief that is contrary to reality, as long as you are aware that it is a personal belief, because there's a lot about reality that is messy and kind of out there. And, like it's not pretty and it doesn't always conform to exactly how you want things to be. Right. But beliefs are very powerful. As somebody who has personal beliefs about how the world is, that I know for a fact is not how the world is, because just the way that I was brought up and the way my brain works, I believe a lot of things that aren't true. And I know that, but these are also things that I think about to kind of help me get through life, right? And I know that I believe these things, and I know I believe incorrect things, but I need them to be able to function as a human being, as a normal human being, because I'm pretty sure, like mechanically broken in my head somewhere.
Just neurologically.
just neurologically. There are wires that have been crossed, and I'm something that I've been struggling with to get right, and like trying to figure out how to like live with that, because like I don't see the world the way anyone else does, and I understand that. So I have created these sets of beliefs to bring myself back into a normal, right?
Yeah, into an acceptable normal that allows you to function as a productive member of society,
function as a human being.
Because there are a lot of people who have your set of conditions who are not, right?
Yeah. And here's the thing. Most people have these beliefs. They just don't realize it. And not like my specific ones, but like most people will have a belief about the world that they know is incorrect or that is observably incorrect, but it is useful for them to think about. And it is useful for them to have that belief to move them forward or to make a better positive change. But unfortunately, those beliefs are held for the complete opposite reason. They're either held because of an insecurity, like you were saying, or because of this need. Well, I guess it all comes back to insecurity. I was gonna say, like this need to control their environment or control the people around them.
Right. A therapist will say those are all insecurity problems.
Exactly. That's what my therapist said. But no. The idea that people have these beliefs that are wrong. It's okay to have those beliefs. It's okay to have personal beliefs that are incorrect factually on an observable, real, this is how the world works level, incorrect. It's useful. on a personal level to have them. And that's it. On a personal level. Keep it inside yourself, hold it to yourself, and say that if this is like the crutch that I need to get through the day, understand that that's what it is.
Yeah, which I think isn't necessarily to say that like it is wrong to say evangelize your worldview, right? Like again, if you believe that it is an inherent good, right? Like I was mentioning earlier, right? Like I believe that my view is something that is good, right? And therefore there is reason to share it and try and convince people of it. But again,
but if that's the only thing you do, though,
right, yeah. If needing to like have somebody be convinced, right, is part of your criteria for success, right? Then that's when something goes horribly wrong. But yeah, and I think what you're getting at is a very fascinating, I guess, coming from you at least, a very fascinating, I guess, justification of the very idea of faith. Because that's essentially what faith is, right? In a large degree, is how your worldview kind of shapes things and how the kind of separation of truth and fact, right? That I think we do a poor job of here in the West. Mm-hmm. Because I think especially...
I think that's mostly what I'm getting at right now. Yeah. Is the separation of truth and fact.
Right. Because, and this is an issue particularly, I guess, in my area of study, especially with like regards to the Bible, because there's definitely a lot in like Christendom that, I'm not going to name names like Ken Ham, but like a lot of people who are very ardent about the factuality, right, of things.
The literal interpretation.
The literal factuality of certain aspects of their worldview. But then like, the problem with that, especially when it comes to like biblical interpretation, is that like that requires that's a particularly modern perspective, first of all, right? That is a very modern post-Enlightenment scientific approach.
Yeah.
It is not the way that humans have universally done things at all places at all times. Is this need for factual certainty, right? This like as John from the Bible Project puts it, like the camcorder footage, exactitude of knowing like what really happened, right? And the issue,
some documentary team back in time,
exactly, right? And especially with regards again to my area of study, like with the biblical stuff, it's just like that's also just not the purpose of the text, right? It was not at all written with the idea of being a complete factual record, right? If it was, there'd be like a lot more unity in a lot of factual accounts that are within it. But that's just not the way it was designed. It was not made with that intention. It was made to convey truth, not necessarily facts.
And that's the thing when it comes to a lot of just like religion or spiritual, what do you call that? Like institutionalized spiritual beliefs, right? The texts that are created out of that usually aren't historical texts. They are stories of somebody living through a historical moment.
Yes.
Which are very different things.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And
like this is not a record of exactly what happened, but this is somebody telling their story of going through that event.
Yes, precisely. And that in many ways is more powerful, in my opinion. Maybe that's just my bias as an artist. But I think storytelling is way more powerful ultimately than a history book. And I think a history textbook, I should say.
There's places for both. There's places for both.
Sure. But you know what I mean? But like, I think it's ultimately stories that change the world, right? And ultimately, as we mentioned previously, with regards to narrative, right? It's stories that shape our reality and our outlook on it. And so it's like, that's an incredibly powerful thing. But I guess for some people, it's not enough, right? Like they need that factual grounding. And again, I think that's an impulse that's born out of insecurity, but you can have a really powerful claim and like clinging onto truth, right? Without having to assert a level of factuality that you may or may not be wrong about, right? Like it's like,
right.
And oftentimes like you're not the best judge of whether or not you are, right? Because you have certain biases and whatnot.
Biases, and
there's a lot of things that could go wrong that are completely outside of your control that could cause you to be factually incorrect about things. But that doesn't mean you can't have a standing of truth to go on, right? Of just like what you observe to be true about the reality we live in, and seeing goodness in that, and wanting to be convincing of that to the best of your ability. And that is something that cannot be taken away from you. I suppose that's a bit of a closing thoughts for me. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
this ended up going a lot deeper than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
We ended up talking about, I mean, because it is a fundamental worldview thing that I'm talking about, but like we ended up talking a lot more about the construction of worldview, which is a fascinating thing to talk about as well. Maybe we'll talk more about that on a future episode, because that's something I want to talk about, especially with you, because we have such different worldviews.
Right.
Like how that manifests in our life and how we got to that point.
Yes, especially I think because and maybe you, I'm going to use the Green Brothers, the Vlogbrothers term of journey of meaning, right? We've both been kind of on a journey.
Right.
I've certainly been in a period of deconstruction for like about the past 3 years or so, I would say. A pretty intense period of deconstruction for my own worldview, which has been just wonderful. I'd recommend it to anybody. And I'm not sure if you could say the same, but like it certainly helped me to understand what I actually believe and how. And now I actually have a path for how I got there, right? Whereas I don't think I had that before. I think I had mostly inherited beliefs, but I think that was, after a period of deconstruction, I now have like actual clearer understanding of just like what I actually believe and how I got there. And that's been kind of wonderful. And has honestly been incredibly, incredibly fruitful, even if it's a very painful process, but very fruitful. So I'd be curious the same of you.
It's actually kind of interesting you use the word like inherited belief, because I know like with our family, these beliefs are kind of like the Christianity tradition is kind of like passed down, right?
To some extent. We actually don't have as big of a legacy of it as some families do, but yes, there is an extent.
That is true. I guess I'm mostly talking about like our immediate family, right?
Sure.
But actually it's interesting because I think I'm on the exact opposite journey of you're deconstructing your inherited beliefs and I'm coming to terms with my non-belief, because that is primarily how I came to have most of the beliefs that I have. It was a solid rejection of belief. Like I didn't want to believe in anything. I was like, no, this is wrong and you're wrong. And you should feel bad. I'm not going to believe that. I'm going to believe the opposite of that actually. And then I'm like, wait a minute, just because I don't find it useful to have those set of beliefs doesn't mean the opposite is good.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm now realizing, obviously, I am a very spiritual person, and unfortunately not so much recently, but I do have a very spiritual like practice, I guess.
Right. You have disciplines.
Yes. Yeah. Let's go with that. And like I'm coming to realize like I am somewhere in the middle. I am very much so.
The spectrum.
Secular.
Spectrum's back. Get out of here.
Again, the spectrum. Everything's a spectrum, and I am somewhere on that spectrum. That is a fact.
I'm definitely on the spectrum.
Oh yeah, get it in there for sure.
But yes,
but like that's the thing is like I'm now coming to realize that a lot of my beliefs are vestigial beliefs that I held to spite another belief.
Yes,
and I'm like, that's not healthy.
Yes, well, it's equally dogmatic to define yourself in opposition.
Yeah. And because I'm now going through this, I've realized there's a lot of people in just like my life in the cultures that I find myself being drawn to, a lot of people who are in those cultures because of that same thing of like the world is a certain way. They experience the world in a certain way, and they were told that the world is a different way. And so they said, you're wrong. And I know you're wrong. So I'm going to believe the opposite of whatever you say.
Yeah.
And I realized like that is, it's a good way to get yourself out of it, but it is not a sustainable belief.
Yeah, because eventually you do have to have your own opinions. Yeah. Otherwise, and it also makes you very vulnerable to going down like really terrible paths, honestly, if you constantly, consistently do that. Because then you could be pretty easily convinced of things that you know to be wrong and still pursue that, right?
Just because it's the punk thing to do. No,
basically.
No, but like, yeah, I guess the way I would kind of close my statements out is just there is a spectrum. That is just an observable fact. However, it is not evenly weighted across the entire spectrum, which I think a lot of people are trying to convince other people of, which is not useful. And it's just as not useful as believing in a binary, is believing the spectrum is uniformly distributed. The spectrum exists. There's a bimodal distribution, and boiling that bimodal distribution down into a binary is perfectly fine as long as you understand that the binary is not concrete.
I think that's a pretty good conclusion, and perhaps a good summary to end it on. So yeah, thank you all very much for listening. This has been a bit meandering, but I think
a little bit meandering.
I think in an interesting way, though, because again, it gets into the weeds of a lot of conversations that we like to have, and that I think we've actually managed to tackle in a much more fundamental, almost theoretical level here. So
yeah, I guess like when we started this, I was like, I don't have that much to say. I'm only just like kind of trying to explain the fundamental truth that I have about the world.
yeah. But then I started talking, and now we're in conversation.
But that's the thing. It's just like it would have been so much quicker to just talk about the gender. But I was like, no, I'm going to make it more general. I'm going to talk about literally everything.
Yeah, it turns out we have to talk for at least an hour when we get on the subject of life, the universe, and everything. So
turns out it's a universal constant.
Thank you all very much for listening. This has been the Hypercube podcast. This show is edited by Loryn Pacheco, mixed by Raphael Pacheco, with original theme music by Mono Memory. Until next time, we'll see you all later. God bless.
You do you, and you rock at it.